Ready to start? Okay. All the clocks are different. Good afternoon and welcome to the Cato Institute. I'm David Bowes, Executive Vice President of the Institute. I want to welcome all of you there. I particularly welcome the C-SPAN audience and particularly C-SPAN Radio here on the second day of C-SPAN's radio presentation. Economics is a subject that seems counterintuitive to a lot of normal people. At best, economics is the dismal science telling us that we can't have everything we want. At worst, it may seem positively perverse, telling us that diamonds are more valuable than water, or that raising the minimum wage law will actually hurt low-income workers who get the minimum wage. So today we're going to talk about puzzles and paradoxes in economics, which is the title of a new book by Mark Skousen and Kenna Taylor. Perhaps the biggest economic puzzle of all is the basic one: how does the economy work? How do millions of people in the Washington area get fed every day, count on finding food and clothes and other goods wherever they need them? Frederick Bastiat and Henry Hazlitt both wrote about this in their books. How does a city get fed? In my own book, Libertarianism, a Primer, I put it this way: when I go to the supermarket, I encounter a veritable cornucopia of food, from milk and bread to Wolfgang Puck's Spago pizza and fresh kiwis from New Zealand. The average supermarket contains 30,000 items today, double the number just 10 years ago. And like most shoppers, I take this abundance for granted. I stand in the middle of this culinary festival and say something like, "I can't believe this crummy store doesn't have diet caffeine-free Coke in 12-ounce cans." It's an amazing plethora of food, and we complain about these little things that are missing. But the question is, how does this marvelous feat happen? How is it that I, who couldn't find a farm with a map, can go to a store at any time of day or night and expect to find all the food I want in convenient packages and ready for purchase, with extra quantities of turkey in November and lemonade in June? Who plans this complex undertaking? Well, the secret, of course, is precisely that no one plans it. No one could plan it. And recently, in our century, when some very smart people decided that it surely made more sense to plan the economy than to leave everything up to the chaotic marketplace, the result was people standing in line for bread after thousands of years of producing bread. Now, one would hope we've learned that lesson, but the fact that the President of the United States could propose planning the system that provides our medical care suggests that the hope for planning springs eternal. Anyway, our speaker today works to improve public understanding of economics and the paradoxes therein in a variety of ways. Mark Skousen is the editor of Forecast Strategies, a popular investment newsletter. He's the author of several books on investing, including High Finance on a Low Budget and Scrooge Investing. He's recently become a columnist for Forbes magazine, as well as a columnist for and he contributes articles to Reason, Liberty, and the Wall Street Journal. He's written several books on economic theory, including Economics on Trial and The Structure of Production. He's an adjunct professor of economics and finance at Rollins College in Florida, where his co-author Kenna Taylor also teaches. And the reason we're here today, his latest book is Puzzles and Paradoxes in Economics. We have a few copies for sale here today, but if we run out, it's available from Laissez-Faire Books at 1-800-326-0996. The publisher's price is $75, but Laissez-Faire offers it for just $24.95. So, to discuss the puzzles and paradoxes of economics, we're very pleased to welcome Mark Skousen.
Thank you very much, David. It's a pleasure to be here. And speaking of economics, I'm always reminded of the time I had lunch with Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning free market economist. And he's famous for making the statement, "There's no such thing as a free lunch." Well, I took him out to lunch, and we spent a couple of hours talking and discussing a variety of things. I had a couple of bones to pick with Professor Friedman. And when it was all through, I said, "Please let me pay." So I paid with my credit card, and afterwards I said, "So in the future, I don't want to ever hear that your statement, there's no such thing as a free lunch because I'm paying for yours. And he thought for a moment, and he looked at me and he said, no, no, Mark, that's not correct. I had to listen to you for 2 hours. So there is still no such thing as a free lunch. It's a delight to be here at the Cato Institute and to talk about puzzles and paradoxes in economics, which has been an area that I've been quite fascinated with for some time, both on the microeconomic level, the supermarkets, and I'll talk about some examples of that, as well as the national issues, the macroeconomic issues that often puzzle us or are paradoxical in our lives. So I hope to cover both a little bit of the lighter side of economics and the deeper aspects of economic theory and policy. The co-author of this book, Puzzles and Paradoxes in Economics, is a colleague of mine at Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida, Ken Taylor. And I noticed in the brochure at the Laissez-Faire Books catalog listed both of us as free market Austrian economists. And that's not quite accurate. Ken Taylor is, he calls himself a neo-institutionalist. And I'm not sure exactly what that means, but basically he questions a lot of the things that I assert and vice versa. And just the other day we inscribed to each other a copy of our book, and I just wanted to tell you what I wrote to Ken Taylor and what he wrote to me. I wrote to Ken Taylor, who puts question marks after too many great truths, and signed it. And then he came back and said, to Mark Skousen, who puts exclamation points after many dubious assertions. So what we ended up doing, since we agreed to disagree, you'll notice in the book, and we have about 44 puzzles and paradoxes that we discuss in the work, and we've decided to author each one of them on our own. So you'll see at the end of each one initials. My initials for ones that I wrote, and then his initials for the ones he wrote. Of course, we both critiqued each other, we added things and so on, but our styles are different, our philosophies are different in many cases. So you need to understand the approach that we took here on this subject. Now, what I'd like to start off with is to talk a little bit about what I call grocery store, supermarket economics, because there's a lot of practical day-to-day examples of paradoxes and puzzles in economics. And then afterwards I'll talk about the national issues and some of the puzzles involved with that. So first of all, as part of the program here, I went to the grocery store. And I went to Publix down in Florida. I live in Florida. And when a friend of mine, Bob Smither, who is the dean of the Hamilton Holt School at Rollins College, he said, boy, this book looks really interesting. Can you answer me just one question? Why is it that in the supermarket the hot dog buns come in 8s and the hot dogs come in 10s? I've always wanted. So I went to, being an empirical Austrian free market economist, and I know there aren't too many of those, but I decided to test whether this is in fact the case. So sure enough, I found hot dogs come in 8s, and hot dog buns come in 8, and hot dogs come in 10s. And of course, the argument is that there's some giant conspiracy going on between Oscar Mayer and and Merida, the bread makers, forcing you, in essence, if you buy one of these, you've got to buy at least two of these, or try to figure out some combination that brings the two matching. So the fact of the matter is that really these are two complementary goods. We talk about that in economics all the time, where you have to have one with, can't have one without the other, usually. It's not always the case, but essentially what happened was these two industries grew separately. Bread, as you know, has always been, from the point of view of the dozens. And while in the case of the hot dogs and other meats, it's sold by the pound, and it was convenient to do 1/10 of a pound, and so they started off with 10 hot dogs to a package. But you'll be interested in knowing economists have won a victory for the consuming public, because now if you go to the store, you'll find that 80 to 90% of all hot dog packages are now in 8s. And without a government edict. Can you believe it? Okay. Now, here's another example of, you didn't know you were going to get all this information, did you? This is very exciting for me anyway. By the way, because we had resolved this puzzle, the hot dog puzzle is not in the book. Maybe it should be as one that we've solved, but one that is still in the book is called the costly ketchup example. Now, here we have Heinz ketchup in the smaller container and one in the larger container. To get the specs right on this, we basically have a 20-ounce Heinz ketchup, which sells for $1.19, and then you have the very jumbo ketchup that is 64-ounce and sells for $3.09. But as you all know, everything is done on a per unit basis. And which one costs more per unit, per ounce? Amazingly, it's this one. And not only does this occur in ketchup, but it also occurs in tuna fish and something that David Bose tells me he no longer eats, peanut butter. And it's, I think, rather amazing to me how there are so many, and these are things that are well known and we discuss and document and do incredible detailed research. This is the kind of thing economists really get into, you see, is to try to solve real problems for everyday shoppers and trying to deal with this problem. But in each case, the peanut butter, the per unit price is higher, larger packaged products, the larger tuna fish, than the smaller ones. Now, is this one of these classic examples of where big business is taking advantage of the ignorance of the public? Because normally the public would assume, well, you get a better deal the larger the package, the so-called bulk purchases or economies of scale. Well, the fact of the matter is that the supply and demand, the costs, are different. The demand factors and the costs are different for each one of these products. I think it's generally true that economies of scale and bulk purchases do work. In other words, if you went to the manufacturer of peanut butter and you ordered 100 of these, you're going to get a discount on each one of those. Okay, so that's the basic principle of bulk purchase. However, here you actually have separate products. Demand and supply factors are different. In fact, the cost of producing this and the space that is involved in this larger ketchup actually increases the space and the cost a lot more than you would think, rather than the cost of the smaller unit. And so sometimes the per unit cost can actually be higher. So from a supply side, costs are sometimes higher with larger bulk items. In addition, the demand factor is different. Most people buy the smaller units and the number, size of family going down. This is much more popular and they can produce a lot more of these. They don't produce as many of these, and yet there's still demand for the larger product. So again, the demand factor is different, and that's why when you go to the grocery store, you'll see, and everything is, you know, quoted in per ounce, per unit cost, you'll see that it's a better deal for you to buy the smaller packages. So see, you've already learned something. I'm sure that this will save you money the next time you go into the grocery store. Although my wife told me the other day that she bought a larger size even though she noticed the per unit price was higher, just for the convenience factor. She didn't want to have to keep coming back to the store to replenish it. So see, that again is a demand factor. So actually what the manufacturers are doing what the superstore or the grocery stores are doing does make some logical sense. I don't think they're totally taking advantage of the ignorance of consumers. Although there is an ignorance factor, there's no question about it. You talk to people all the time who say, yeah, I just bought this item and I didn't really look at the per unit price, even though it's there. So these are just some of the examples, the types of things that, that I think can show you how economics can be useful in explaining these anomalies or puzzles in economics. Now, another example of one that's called the Washington apple dilemma. Went to great lengths to prove this one. Here we have two Washington apples. Called the Washington apple dilemma. Why is it that the best Washington apples are exported? Why is it that the best Florida oranges are exported? Italian leather, Argentine beef, there's lots of examples of this, but it normally comes down to what is known as the Washington apple dilemma. Why is it that this apple, which I bought at the grocery store and had a really nice little emblem on it that says delicious in Washington, this listed the state of Washington on it. And then I had a good friend of mine to go into the grocery store in Washington, mail this to me from Washington State as one of their really delicious Washington apples. And look at the difference. It's truly amazing. And how can you explain this? I have a discussion of this in question number, puzzle number 22. And let me read to you how this got started. I think you'll find this, this one interesting. A consumer wrote the Seattle Times and says, why are Washington apples in local markets so small and odd looking? Recently, apple picking friends brought some apples they had just picked, and they were at least 4 times the size of those available for sale here. Where do these big, delicious apples go? Are they shipped to Europe, to the East, or can they be bought here in Seattle? Signed to MWP. And took 2 economists to do extensive research in finding out why this was the case. And the 2 economists are Armin Alchian and William. Both teach it. They both taught at the time at the University of Washington and now teach at UCLA. And they found out that basically the reason is because the cost, the additional cost of shipping makes the larger, more high-quality product more desirable relative to the smaller, cheaper one. Now, I can go into some detail mathematically as to why that is the case, but concluded that it's a pretty broad-based theory. They said that it says they've look at it says, in short, whenever a tax, transportation expense, or other fixed cost is added to a variable cost of a product, the Alchian-Allen effect takes place. Consumers tend to shift their tastes in favor of higher quality products. So we can, again, even though it doesn't make a lot of common sense, we can demonstrate economically why the higher quality, higher priced item tends to be exported more than the smaller, inferior product, as we see here with the Washington apples. Another example is a little bit more common, and this is the known as the diamond water paradox. I did bring some water here, or I should say the Cato Institute provided me a little bit of water. And unfortunately, I don't wear a diamond, so we don't have a diamond here, but I'm sure there are diamonds among you for the visual effect. And the diamond water paradox is one that's been around for many years and really has a lot of deeper implications than the examples that I've used previously. In the case of the diamond water paradox, this is a paradox that Adam Smith wrestled with and is discussed in his book, The Wealth of Nations. And the question is that why is it that diamonds are expensive but have little practical value? This is Adam Smith speaking. While water is cheap but has great practical value. And this was a major stumbling block with the classical economists. And they basically had a hard time explaining this strange dichotomy. And so what Smith did was, he said, well, our answer is there are products that have value in use, and there are products that have value in exchange, and they're not really related. They're kind of separated and unrelated. So Smith made this rather strange dichotomy of water is value in use, but diamonds are value in exchange. And this puzzle has been solved. It was solved over 100 years ago with the marginal revolution. And you had three economists, Carl Menger, Stanley Jevons, and Leon Walras, who kind of simultaneously around 1870 solved this problem with the argument of marginal product, arguing that the prices, value in exchange, are determined by marginal utility, how much of it extra you have, not their total utility, which is what we would have as value in use. Because water is abundant, an additional unit of water is cheap. Because diamonds are extremely scarce, an additional diamond is expensive. And so we can explain this with the difference between marginal utility and total utility. And it's a pretty easy way to explain it. Well, one of the things really interesting historically about Adam Smith is that he himself solved this problem based on marginal analysis earlier, prior to the writing of The Wealth of Nations. And if you look at his lectures on jurisprudence, you'll see that Adam Smith talks about the marginal use of water versus diamonds. So people have always wondered, how is it that Adam Smith forgot his answer, his solution to this problem? Was it absent-mindedness? You know, Adam Smith was famous for being very absent-minded. But I don't think it was absent-mindedness as much as it was a change in his, or a recognition of his religious beliefs. Now let me explain what I mean by that. This it's been developed rather interestingly by an article by Roger Garrison at Auburn University. You'll find that Smith was a Presbyterian, steeped in Calvinist values. And his Calvinist values emphasized the goodness of hard work, useful production, and frugality. And The Wealth of Nations is full of high-mindedness and virtue. In his mind, diamonds and jewels were vain luxury items and relatively useless compared to water and other useful products. And his economic theory, therefore, reflected this value. For example, readers are frequently baffled by Smith's old dichotomy between productive and unproductive labor. For example, Smith refers to the occupations of ministers, physicians, musicians, orators, actors, and other producers of services as frivolous. While farmers and other producers and manufacturers, they're viewed as productive. He uses the term productive. Why? Because Smith's Presbyterian conscience argued against consumption in favor of saving and hard work. As Roger Garrison states, quote, "The basis for the distinction is not physiocratic fallacies, but Presbyterian values. Productive labor is future-oriented, unproductive labor is present-oriented." Now, the impact of Smith's dichotomy of value in use versus value in exchange has a much greater impact. In fact, it gave a lot of fodder to the socialist movement. Because they constantly make a difference in the marketplace between production for profit and production for use, as if they're unrelated. And they criticize capitalism for being more interested in making profits than providing a useful purpose, as if profitable exchange is unrelated to consumer use. And again, this goes back to Smith and his dichotomy. So even though it's all in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, that includes a lot of fallacies. So much for the diamond water paradox. Now, another one is Keynes's banana plantation. I wasn't able to pick up a banana, but you all know what one looks like. I want to tell you the story of Keynes's banana plantation. It's a very interesting example as we move into the famous paradox of thrift, the idea that savings is counterproductive in the economy. And this view has been a red line through history for the last 100 or 200 years. And Keynes reflected many of this. There are a lot of anti-saving sentiments in Keynes. And he tells a rather interesting story that we describe in our paradox number 27, called Keynes's Banana Plantation. And in his book, The Treatise on Money, published in 1930, the beginning of the Depression, the British economist John Maynard Keynes raised the prospect that savings could be abortive if not invested. And he used the analogy of the banana plantation to demonstrate this point. He says, suppose you have a community devoted its entire production to bananas, and members of the community engage in a thrift campaign at a time when the plantation needs no additional investment capital. So the same number of bananas are produced, but because of lower final demand, the price of bananas falls. The total crop is sold, but the banana producers suffer a loss. Costs of production remain the same, but total revenues have fallen. The plantation owners are therefore forced to reduce wages or lay off workers, either of which causes a recession in the spending power of the public. In turn, consumers buy even less bananas, which results in more layoffs. This vicious cycle continues until there are no banana production at all and the community starves to death. A rather depressing view of savings, isn't it? Well, what is wrong with this basic concept or this story? Is there a problem with Keynes' story? And the problem is, of course, the argument that here you have a community, their only business is the production of bananas, and they suddenly begin a thrift campaign, and for no reason. In other words, the company doesn't need additional capital. That's what Keynes argues. And see, there's where the problem is. Why would a community that consists of producers of one product engage in a thrift campaign if they don't need additional capital? So it's a contradiction in terms. That's how he created it. And he did it on purpose because he argued that savers and investors are two different groups. And you can create some real problems in industry and macroeconomic theory when savers and investors are not the same people. But I would even disagree with Keynes' story on this count. He forgets the interest rate factor. And Keynes had a problem in the 1930s in almost all of his theories, assuming that interest rates were low and wouldn't go any lower. But if you have a normal interest rate type of situation and a community engages in a thrift campaign, that's going to increase the supply of capital, which will reduce interest rates. Now, if you reduce interest rates, it will allow the producers, the manufacturers of bananas, to go out and buy additional equipment, to buy computers that are new and much more efficient, for example, and other tools and equipment, which is usually bought on loan, on a lease basis, and where interest rates are a very significant factor. So by doing so, the community could actually benefit by having a more productive banana plantation, and even at the same time lower prices for bananas, the output of the product. So I don't see any problem in resolving the example of Keynes's banana plantation. But there are many examples of this paradox of thrift concept. Paul Samuelson, the Nobel Prize-winning MIT economist who's written the most successful textbook ever on economics, will be celebrating the 50th anniversary of his textbook in December when he comes out with his 16th edition. He is, in every edition except one, he has had this paradox of thrift explanation or concept in there based on Keynes's original anti-savings views. But he's gradually shifted over the years and started to put a lot more pro-savings material in. He has 2 or 3 pages now on why the savings rate is too low in the United States and how it needs to be increased. So I think that that's an example of where he's finally shifting away from this anti-savings view of the paradox of thrift. But you do encounter this from time to time in a lot of economics. And essentially, I think the biggest problem with the paradox of thrift idea, the idea that consumer spending is what drives the economy, there are many examples of these kinds of Keynesian fallacies in the business world. I recall I had a friend of mine who was what I call a Keynesian businessman. And his view was always hire, never fire. The more you spend, the more you bring in revenue. And this can work for some period of time. In this particular business that he was engaged in, a mail order business, he would hire people. He hired me for a considerable amount of money, and I wasn't really doing a lot, so he gave me a raise. He was a very strange character, and for a while it worked. What goes around comes around. The more money he spent, the more money came to him. But eventually he went bankrupt, as most Keynesian businessmen do, because the problem is that the money doesn't necessarily come back to you that you spend on a particular product. And this is evident in one of our other puzzlers that we deal with, and this is the example of the Henry Ford story, which is number 34 in our book. We have a very interesting case, 2 situations. One is 1914, when Henry Ford raised wages to the famous $5 a day for each worker. In 1914, Henry Ford tripled the average wage at his auto factory to $5 a day. Ford hired new workers, and productivity and profits both increased substantially. However, in 1930, Ford raised wages in real terms, but profits fell, and Ford had to lay off workers. And how do you explain this difference between the 2 events? Well, in the early 1910s, the Ford Motor Company was the most successful auto company in the world. And sales were growing rapidly. Ford sales rose from 42 million to 89 million just in 1 year, in 1913. Net income doubled, assets grew, and with these huge profits, Ford decided to share his gains with his employees. It's a very interesting story where for 4 hours the board members and Ford met and tried to decide, well, how much are we going to pay our workers extra? And most of the board simply said, look, let's keep our profits, let's keep it going and not worry about really paying our workers anymore. But Ford was adamant and asked the accountant how much it would cost in terms of profits by raising the wages by 25-cent increments. Well, finally, they went from $2 to $2.50 a day and finally reached $5, and Ford exclaimed, "Stop it, Charlie, it's all settled. $5 a day minimum and at once." And thus was born the famous $5 a day story, which made Henry Ford an industrial messiah. But it also made Henry Ford a vulgar Keynesian, so to speak, as a term that would be used in his case of championing the idea that a higher national wage bill was good because it would put more money in consumers' pockets who then could spend on a variety of goods. And that's what happened to his workers who got $5 a day, because for the first time in their lives, they were able to buy the cars that they were making. Productivity skyrocketed. Thousands of potential employees moved to Detroit in hopes of getting a job. Increased productivity. It was very beneficial. Now let's move to 1930, the beginning of the Great Depression. And that's where Ford's purchasing power theory was challenged following the stock market crash of 1929. Well, in November of 29, President Herbert Hoover called a White House conference and invited Henry Ford and many other industrial leaders to deal with the possible depression. Hoover encouraged these business leaders to maintain real wages during the downturn. Ford was determined to cooperate and even raised wages temporarily, but it didn't work. Sales of his Model A sagged, and he was eventually forced to cut wages. He declared countrywide high wages spell countrywide prosperity, provided, however, that higher wages are paid from higher production. And this explains this puzzler. What is the difference? You see, one of the biggest problems in macroeconomics is we ignore time, which is a big mistake. And in the case of the Ford Motor Company, why were they able to pay $5 a day? Well, because profits had gone up before higher wages were paid. It's a very different thing if you pay higher wages in expectation that profits will go up. If profits are going up before wages are risen, then you can afford to pay a higher wage bill. But to reverse it puts the cart before the horse and can lead to serious problems, including bankruptcy for companies that pay out labor when they don't have the profits to pay it out, in expectation that people will pay more. So that's called the wager over wages. I'll finally end up with this one, which is a financial one, which I'm interested in, being a financial writer. And that is number 44 in our book, Why is Bad News Sometimes Good News on Wall Street? And why is good news on Main Street often bad news on Wall Street? I was just noticing this very last week where the newspapers and the media was reporting that the employment gains were very modest, very little increase in employment gains. Unemployment may actually rise a little, and you've heard that before too. And of course, the stock market is euphoric and goes through the roof. And on the other hand, you hear news where unemployment is falling rapidly, employment is gaining dramatically, and the stock market falls out of bed. And so we try to address this issue of the perversity of Wall Street, which again seems to give capitalism a bad name. And what's interesting about this paradox is the fact that all studies on the prices of securities demonstrate very clearly that they're earnings driven in the long run. You have to have higher earnings and higher profitability in order to have higher stock prices. On a short-term basis, economists say stocks are unpredictable, but on a long-term basis, it's very clear that they're earnings-driven, they're profit-driven. So if you're not going to have the profitability, how can stocks go higher on bad news? Well, the answer is really a reflection of what is known as the rational expectations revolution in economics, which is also now pervades the financial markets. And what's actually happening is that the market is responding or trying to respond to what they regard as artificially positive good news. News that cannot last. In other words, too often Wall Street has been burned by excessive economic growth that could not last. And why was it excessive? Because it was stimulated artificially by easy credit and artificial low interest rates, which creates a bubble on Wall Street, and everyone knows that a bull market that's excessive cannot last and ends in a crash or a bear market of one sort or another. And that is the fear. But there have been periods of time, the early 1960s is a good example, where you had very high economic growth, 4 to 5% per year. Interest rates did not rise particularly during those first 5 years of the 1960s, and the stock market went up rather significantly. So there have been time periods, and there's even periods in foreign countries, particularly in Latin America, where you've had very high economic growth rates recently, high stock market performance, while interest rates and inflation have stayed low. So that puzzler can be explained in terms of rational expectations of the financial markets. Well, I've covered a wide variety of topics here. There's probably a lot of other puzzlers and paradoxes we could talk about. We discuss in the book the Laffer curve debate, the national debt debate. There's a lot of other issues. The whole issue that Charles Murray has raised of the perpetual poverty puzzler. This is one where Ken Taylor and I really go into two separate camps on that, as you'll see in the book. But I'm often reminded of a famous comment that was made, I think it was Harry Grossman, the congressman, and I think this is very appropriate for economics. His statement is that there's always free cheese in a mousetrap. Thank you very much.
All right, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty hungry. Nevertheless, we're going to take a few minutes for questions here. And Mark, I'll just let you call on questioners. Please introduce yourself and your affiliation and wait for a microphone to get to you.
Okay, right there.
Jack Ben Rubin, I'm Northern Virginia Community College. This whole concept, this whole idea about Henry Ford's famous $5 a day has always been publicized to every school kid. I know him. I had learned that when I was taking economics in college. But my professor says, I wish you would verify this thing, that he made a condition on that $5 that you would only be entitled for the $5 raise if you worked there for a year. Or more. And he simply just laid off loads of people when their year was just about arriving. Do you hear anything about that to verify that?
I don't think that's true. He did put some conditions on it. As a matter of fact, one of the things was he had his spies who checked on the morals of and what they were doing with this additional money. So there were some things like that he did. And there may have been some requirements that they work for at least a year, because you see, one of the biggest problems that Ford and other auto manufacturers faced at that time were the constant, the wages were so low before that people were constantly quitting, and they'd have to hire new people. So he wanted to, one of the reasons he paid $5 a day was to keep workers there, and they did. The number of people, the turnover rate was reduced considerably during that time period. Jonathan Hughes has written eloquently, and very good history, by the way, called The Vital Few, and tells this story in quite detail. I would also disagree with you in saying that the Henry Ford $5 a day story is not is told by all kids in school and so forth. I think very few kids know that story, and I think more need to know that story. It's a good story in terms of labor relations and productivity, but it also needs to be told in conjunction with the 1930 story to show that this idea of a purchasing power, that you can simply increase people's wages and therefore increase their purchasing power, That only makes sense if it comes out of profits that have already been made. Yes?
I want to ask a question about socialism. All over the world, you find socialism being dismantled. Everywhere you look. Walt Robinson, a member. Socialism is being dismantled all over the world, and they're going to free enterprise. I think it's pretty evident. But here in the United States, it's expanding. Now, is this because of the government creep, or what is your explanation why we don't disavow socialism here as they do in other countries?
So this is a puzzler to you. Well, I think the jury is out to what extent socialism is increasing. One of the interesting graphs, it'd be nice to show this, I don't know how many of you have seen this graph, The Economist published it in the last couple of months. It shows the increase in government spending as a percent of GDP. It shows that it has been steadily increasing, but at a lower rate. And it suggests that it's a topping out phenomenon. And in fact, in China, it's just the opposite. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal on that by, I think, Martin Feldstein, pointing out that government as a percent of GDP in China has been dropping rather dramatically. In the United States, I do think you have some dynamic things that are changing. One, of course, is the movement toward a balanced budget, which I think will result in substantial tax cutting and a reduction in government regulation. So I'm an optimist in those terms. There's no question about it. In an emergency kind of situation, there's all kinds of rules and regulations that are going to be imposed. And still, there's a lot of excessive government strangulation of business. But there's still a lot of vibrancy, and one of the reasons is the globalization of the U.S. economy, which has basically tied the hands of a lot of government regulation, whether it's the EPA or OSHA or what have you, because all of these major corporations are becoming multinational and avoiding a lot of the ridiculous regulations. So that's why you still see a lot of economic growth in the U.S. and a lot of, and a major bull market on Wall Street, is because the government has not strangled, the socialistic government has not strangled business as much as you seem to be thinking. Yes, in the back.
My name is Bert Ely. I'm a banking consultant here in Washington, and wanted to touch on the last chapter you discussed, the perversity of Wall Street. I believe what you were effectively suggesting is that this perversity arises out of, if you will, a mispricing of interest rates, and that's what makes it seem perverse. Would you agree with that? And if in fact interest rates, which of course is just the price of credit, are being mispriced, why is that occurring in a market economy?
I think that is, in fact, the easy credit phenomenon of the past is the factor that that Wall Street focuses on. The concern that inflation is coming back, and that's probably why we have high real interest rates still to this day, even though the rate is lower than it was in the early 80s. Why would this occur in a market phenomenon type of situation? Because part of the market is government. And it's a very large part of the market for bonds and debt instruments. In fact, the largest market in the world is the Treasury bill market. And so government, through its discount window and through open market operations, can have a dramatic impact on that. Certainly on a short-term basis, and can create a certain artificiality in interest rate market. So we've seen it happen in the past. I think it can happen again. Now, with the market does try to respond to this, and to the extent that the players of the market interpret properly what the Federal Reserve is doing, then I would think they have a harder time getting away with it. For example, I think Greenspan's remarks every 6 months that the stock market is overvalued and can't be justified is really his own method of perpetuating the bull market and keeping a crash from occurring. Because he's maintaining a rather easy money policy at this point. If you look at money supply growth, it's picking up. So I think he's trying to keep Wall Street from developing into a typical bubble type of situation. Does that answer your question?
We can talk about it further.
Yeah. Okay, others? Yes, in the back.
Tom Palmer from the Cato Institute. Could you comment on the apparent inefficiency in markets for ideas? And I have in mind the persistence of absurd fallacies in public discourse. The doctrine of the balance of trade, which Adam Smith showed was one of the most absurd ideas imaginable, or the common idea, which I just heard on Canadian broadcasting last night, a 10-minute discussion of how the oil companies buy up patents for engines that run on water and keep them from us so that they can keep selling us gas. Totally absurd, and yet I think most people believe it.
Well, boy, that's I'm not sure I have an opinion on that. I do think that having written a book on economics and what is taught in the classroom, I wrote a book called Economics on Trial based on the textbooks of the late 1980s, and I found a great deal of what I would regard as fallacies and false information and that sort of thing. And textbooks of all areas are a good place to see this kind of phenomenon. I'm not sure that it's just a problem of getting information out there. I think it's also your own perspective. It's kind of like the parable of the prodigal son. And there are arguments as to which was the worse son, the elder son or the prodigal son. And the facts are right there, and yet you'll get half the people arguing the prodigal son was better because he came back, and we don't need to worry about the sins of the past. And then you have half arguing the elder son, really his sins were rather minor, including his lack of love for his older brother. And I use that as an example because it demonstrates some fundamentally philosophical differences. And I've found this often as to how people view facts. You can see this in our discussion of the perpetual poverty theory. There's really two views. There's the institutional view that argues that poverty is a cultural phenomenon, and it's really not that closely related to economic incentives and so forth. And then you have the market perspective that Gary Becker and Charles Murray and others argue that welfare is merely an incentive-disincentive kind of situation, and that's why it exists the way it is. But a lot of it, we're all looking at the same statistics, the same facts. I found the same thing about Reaganomics. Supporters of Reaganomics in the 1980s, they look at these statistics and they say, well, yeah, income inequality went down, economic growth was considerable, the deficit was not caused by Reaganomics, and in fact it would have been worse without Reaganomics, etc. And then you have people on the other side looking at Reaganomics, looking at the very same statistics, and they highlight certain other statistics saying inequality of income worsened during this time period, the deficits worsened, and it was Reagan's fault, not Congress. We both look at the very same data and come to different conclusions. So I think a lot of it has to do with people's backgrounds, their cultural differences. It's not purely looking at the facts. Yes, sir. Bill?
I'm Bill Peterson with the Heritage Foundation, and you alluded to Keynes's paradox of thrift, but wouldn't it be interesting if you comment, please, on the Keynes's macro formula of Y equals C plus I plus G, G, of course, for government, and how that plays into his attempted overthrow of Say's law of markets, which I think is behind supply-side economics. Have it go.
Well, Say's law is usually viewed as supply creates its own demand. Keynes reversed that, saying demand creates its own supply. Neither one is really a totally correct view of what Say said. He was talking about individual products and the fact that if you sold a product, you produced something that would be sold, that gave you purchasing power. You now had money that you could go out and spend. So he meant it on a microeconomic basis rather than a macro view, but it's been viewed now as kind of a macro view of the world. Paul Samuelson once said that, he says, I did a review in the Journal of Economic Perspectives on Samuelson's 15 editions of his textbook, and his response to that, you might enjoy that, it's the spring issue, this last issue of the Journal of Economic Perspectives. Samuelson's response was, Skousen is more of a believer in Say's law than I am. But really it makes more sense that supply creates its own demand. But it's supply that is sold. And let me emphasize that again. It's not supplies that are produced. Lots of things are produced but can't be sold on the marketplace. But if supplies are sold, then it does create its own demand. So Say's law has a lot of validity, I think, as long as you understand that. Now take Keynes's view. Demand creates its own supply. Well, I'd like to go to the moon. I'd like to go to San Francisco in less than an hour. I'm demanding that. Well, where's the supply? Well, there's a lot of things that we demand that are not supplied. So demand does not necessarily create its own supply. It creates a wish list, but it doesn't necessarily create its own supply. And one of the biggest dangers of Keynesian economics, and you see this perpetuated in Wall Street and in Main Street, is the idea that consumption drives the economy. And consumption does not drive the economy. Production drives the economy. Production of goods and services that are sold. Now, yes, you need consumers. You need consumers to have producers. All right, but the key to economic growth is not to stimulate production. It gets back to this timing factor. Which comes first? The production or the consumption? Well, production has to come first. You find out what the consumer wants and you produce it and you sell it efficiently at a profit. And then you use those profits to improve the product, to increase your savings, and therefore to make more products and cheaper products. And that is the whole form of economic growth. But if you go out and say your economy is sluggish and there's not a lot of economic growth, Keynes would say, okay, the key is increased consumption. If somehow we can get all the consumers to go out there and go into the grocery stores and go into the supermarkets and go into the automobile stores and buy more consumer goods, that will force producers to produce more. And that's his concept. It's almost like it's a Christmas, kind of like if only Christmas could last year-round. I mean, retailers would like that since 90% of sales occur during the Christmas holidays. And so that is the Keynesian view of stimulating consumption. If consumers won't do it, then government must step in and increase purchases themselves. So that's where you get the C plus I plus G. It all adds up.
Could you comment about G a little further?
Well, a lot of economists think it should be C plus I minus G. But I think that actually economic, as a measure of economic standard of living, it should be C plus I only, C plus I. And G is there, you need to know about G, but if you want to measure standard of living, it's C plus I. It's consumption plus investment. But government is suspect, because just because government builds a road out in the middle of nowhere, that's an addition to G. But is it efficient? Is it productive? I lived in Venezuela for a year, and there was a Venezuelan dictator named Pérez Jiménez, PJ. And he took all this oil money that was productive, useful money, and he was a builder. And he wanted to build roads everywhere. So he built roads out in the middle of nowhere in Venezuela. People wouldn't use the roads. They would go out and stop at the border. And that would be it. And yet, that showed up on GDP statistics as the G increasing more and more and more. So I have some problems with that. I think that the key to economic growth, if the country is sluggish and there isn't a lot of economic growth, the key is to increase savings rather than consumption. And what will that do? That will lower interest rates. That will allow companies to buy a lot of investment goods and new machinery, new products, new computers that they weren't using before, that will increase their productivity, increase their market, lower consumer prices, and therefore will increase consumption. But the increase in consumption comes after, not before, production. So that's the main point I would say about Say's law and the Keynesian view.
All right, if we don't have any more questions, let's thank Mark Skousen, and we will
have some free hot dogs, anyone who wants them.
And we invite you upstairs for lunch, and don't forget to buy a copy of Puzzles and Paradoxes in Economics.